this day when the strong hand of the Lord leads you out of bondage.
The exodus consisted of about 10 Egyptian villages. They'd hired every member of the village to get this vast mass of thousands and thousands of people. Now, they could only shoot it once.
And it took hours to line up. This is all perfectly true.
And Mr. DeMille was on the #1 camera. I was in charge of the #2 camera, shooting straight across, getting targets of opportunity.
So they had long shot, medium shot, close shots, angles, so on. And after the scene, he said, "How was it for you?" to the cameraman. He said, "Sir, I'm sorry, I had to reload. I ran out."
And DeMille is supposed to have sighed and turned to the #2 camera with a close-up lens on it. He said, "Well, you must have gotten some good detail stuff."
And I said, "Well, sir, we got some very good stuff, but it was so dusty."
And he said, "Oh, my God." He said, "Well, how was it for you?" And Harry had just come roaring in a Jeep, and he'd been in command of the top camera, the long shot, the master shot. He said, "Did you get it, Harry?" He said, "Ready when you are, Mr. DeMille."
This, according to legend, is where Cecil B. DeMille created Hollywood. When he arrived on Vine Street in 1913 to make his first film, The Squaw Man, there was little to be seen except a few pepper trees and this barn belonging to one Jacob Stern, which was to serve as DeMille's studio. And it was then, according to the legend, that DeMille said, "Let there be Hollywood," and lo, there was Hollywood, and he looked upon his work and found it good.
Yes, well, I brought the technique of the stage to the screen. We made the first picture that was called the first feature picture, the first 6 reel picture ever made.
Were you influenced by the earlier filmmakers?
The earlier filmmakers? Well, there really weren't any earlier filmmakers.
I suppose there weren't.
Well, it's a nice story, but it's not quite true because other people, including a certain D.W. Griffith, had been making films in Hollywood before DeMille got there. But if he wasn't actually in on the birth of the place as the film capital of the world, he was certainly around for the christening. The Squaw Man cost $15,000, raked in $250,000, and gave an early indication of the kind of profits that were to be made. And when DeMille died, 46 years, 70 films, and umpteen $1 million later, he had outlived most and outstripped all of his fellow pioneers. And Hollywood itself had moved from infancy to childhood to maturity and was already well advanced along the path to decay.
In the first decade of this century, Hollywood was a peaceful country town, happily oblivious of what fate held in store for it. And Cecil B. DeMille was an unsuccessful, unimpressive young actor, touring America with a theatrical troupe and rapidly going prematurely bald, possibly through frustrated ambition. The fact that his elder brother, William, was, by contrast, already a highly acclaimed playwright on Broadway didn't exactly cheer him up either.
Father was a great success as a young man. Cecil was a failure. I think he was hell-bent to show Father up and to show the world he could better.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine.
Cecil Blount DeMille was born in Ashfield, Massachusetts on August the 12th, 1881. His father, Henry, a devout Episcopalian, was a lay preacher and a talented playwright, but he died when Cecil was only 12. Thereafter, the widow DeMille, née Beatrice Samuels, resourcefully turned her home into a girls' school and from her earnings put her younger son through military academy and drama school. When the girls' school failed, she set herself up even more resourcefully as a theatrical agent in New York, where she introduced Cecil to a drama producer named Jessie Lasky. And together with Lasky's brother-in-law, one Samuel Goldfish, later to be known less amusingly as Samuel Goldwyn, the two men set up a company to film stage plays. Cecil, grandly titled Director General of the company, set out west in search of sunshine and constant natural light to turn a Broadway play called The Squaw Man into a movie. He was quite undeterred by the fact that he knew virtually nothing about filmmaking.
But he was sharp. Ooh, and energy. That was a young man with the real conquistador's energy. He was out to get ahead.
He certainly wasted no time. The Squaw Man, having established DeMille as a producer in Hollywood, he swiftly set about learning his trade as a director. At the same time, he created a distinctive image for himself.
He had 3 different names. It was CB, Mr. DeMille, and Chief. And we'd all hush up, and he would walk out of his door right onto the stage. Everything was set. His chair was there in this crypt, and the crew were all in their right places. He didn't have to say, let's get ready.
In his first 2 years in Hollywood, DeMille made 20 films, sometimes working on 2 at once. He made comedies, westerns, dramas, and notably The Cheat, a small masterpiece of the silent cinema, which daringly broke new ground by showing a relationship between a white woman and an Oriental, and also introduced touches of explicit sadism that became rather a feature of DeMille movies.
And he was such a good director at the beginning. So sincere and so good, and so able. And he got hired all sorts of very interesting people to come west and be with him. Splendid people.
Among those splendid people was the opera singer Geraldine Farrar, who, among other things, starred silently in Carmen for him. Quite soon, the Lasky studio became the place where everyone wanted to work.
But that was a Garden of Eden. That's where everybody dreamed dreams and wanted to be inside that studio. So I used to look at it and wonder if I could ever get in there.
Well, she did get in there, and with a series of comedies and dramas about marriage and divorce, DeMille made her a very big star indeed. The films had titles like Don't Change Your Husband, Why Change Your Wife, For Better, For Worse, and The Affairs of Anatole. They reflected, without any overt disapproval from the deeply religious DeMille, the looser morals of the Jazz Age. DeMille's own marriage, however, was on the face of it exemplary. In 1902, he'd married Constance Adams, the daughter of a Boston judge, and they had a daughter whom he christened with becoming modesty, Cecilia. Later, they adopted 3 more children and set themselves up alongside Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford as a kind of royal family of Hollywood.
As to Los Angeles society, DeMille always cultivated that side because it was very useful to him. I mean, he knew bankers. He knew society. His daughter was Blue Book, Social Register, that sort of thing. He liked to talk about his Norman ancestry, DeMille.
The mother was a British Jewess, and some of us have inherited some of her features, but Cecil didn't like it. And he always told me, for instance, I never could be photographed because I had the Jewish nose, you see.
He kept his Jewish profile rather low. He wasn't certainly proud of it.
If DeMille wasn't quite the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant that he appeared to be, nor was he the faithful husband that he appeared to be. He remained devoted, but not constant, to Constance, for he had at least 2 long-running affairs with other women. The first of these was Julia Fay, a young actress who had 1, or rather 2, particular attributes that caught his attention.
He liked her feet. They were so small. See, certain things about certain women, certain men like. That seemed to be his passion, was her feet.
He was crazy about feet, you know. He was a podophile. Beautiful feet. And Julia Fay had the most beautiful feet in Los Angeles, he said.
Julia Fay's rival and the object of DeMille's other notable extramarital relationship was Jeannie McPherson. Little is known about Miss McPherson's feat, but what is certain is that she was already a writer, actress and film producer before becoming DeMille's chief scriptwriter.
I would say that underneath it all, she was his main part of life. She was his whole life.
But they drifted apart eventually, except professionally. And he used her professionally until he felt that she didn't fit in with talkies. And she was also ill. She was dying of cancer. And so she was in the hospital. And it was very sad, really, because she had given him the best years of her life, literally.
In the early days of their collaboration, Jeannie McPherson helped DeMille create on screen a glamorous and improbable lifestyle to which post-World War I America could aspire. In particular, DeMille created the bathroom. Bathrooms had, of course, existed before then, but rarely so opulently or sensuously as he envisaged them. His inspiration for these toilet fantasies came from the more flamboyant Victorian painters, whose work could be as naughty as they liked, so long as the subject of the picture was historical and therefore respectable.
The other great trademark, which became part of every DeMille thing, was the flashback. For instance, in Male and Female, when Thomas Meehan says, "When I was a king in Babylon and you were my Christian slave," to Gloria Swanson, there is an immediate flashback to the time when he was a king in Babylon and she was brought in as a Christian slave to him, and she would not recant her religion. So much as he desired her, he tossed her to the lions. When you went to a DeMille production, you knew what you were going to see. You knew that you were going to be entertained, and it had just what it boasted of having, and more.
DeMille's success in Hollywood was not only rapid, but instant. In New York, he'd hardly made any kind of mark at all, either as an actor or as a playwright. But almost from the moment he arrived in Hollywood, he swiftly became one of the most powerful and influential directors around. It was as if he and the cinema had been created specifically for one another. Furthermore, he was quick to realize the importance of money in a town where success is measured almost exclusively in dollars. And so while his contemporaries were happily and cheerfully squandering their fat new incomes, he was amassing a considerable fortune by investing his earnings in banks, in oil wells, in shares, and in vast acres of rich Californian land. He was also greatly interested in flying and even started, in a modest way, one of America's first commercial airlines. For some time, indeed, he was almost as interested in that as he was in the cinema. Never quite as interested, though, for as early as 1916, when he made a film about Joan of Arc, he discovered the kind of picture that most excited him, the spectacular.
It was an extraordinary film, and it struck something in his nature. He said, "I never fell in love with the spectacle until I made Joan the woman."
We used to fill this valley out here with people, extras. It was a showmanship. It was a big deal, like a circus coming to town. Yeah, let's say it that way. When he presented himself anywhere, it was like a circus coming. There was always the band ahead of him.
In 1922, DeMille, ever eager for publicity, asked the cinema goers to suggest a theme for his next film. By overwhelming public demand, the choice was the Ten Commandments. It was filmed partly in black and white and partly in experimental Technicolor, and it was the perfect opportunity which DeMille seized avidly for super-colossal spectacle.
He knew he had the gift for the spectacular. He liked to paint with a broad pen, palette. One of the inspirations that he reached into all the time were the illustrations of Doré.
Gustave Doré had illustrated a best-selling edition of the Bible which helped to shape the way in which Victorians saw the stories. DeMille had grown up with these drawings, and they had a deep influence on all his ambitious biblical films. In his efforts to achieve the most dramatic and eye-catching effects, DeMille could be quite ruthless.
My impression was, having worked extra in several pictures with him, he was cruel, sadistic, sarcastic, and other adjectives like that makes you love a man.
In the background, he goes here and say, you know, that was the opinion of people. That was the expression of the general. Yet he was paying the salary of all those people, see, and they were all clamoring to be there. Everyone wanted to be with DeMille.
The Ten Commandments took $4 million at the box office, no doubt less on account of the religious content than of the special effects, which were impressive even by today's standards. But DeMille's considerable extravagance had brought him into disfavor with the Lasky company, and in 1925 he left to become an independent producer. He took with him a trusty band of helpers and the Holy Bible. Thus equipped, he made the story of Christ and called it King of Kings. Now, at that time, depicting Christ on a cinema screen was a most hazardous business, and to play the role, DeMille chose with great care H.B. Warner, an actor of spotless reputation and blameless habits. Spotless and blameless, that is, until he fell victim to an enterprising, though unscrupulous actress who seduced him quite comprehensively in his dressing room, and then, thinking to benefit financially from her deed, dragged DeMille to the scene of this sinful action.
And there on the floor, debauched, his clothes off, lip rouge all over him, a wreck, drunk, was H.B. Warner. And he knew that the film would be finished if one breath got out. So he said, "How much do you want?" And she named an astounding figure. And he said, "We will consider this." He then, as I know it, called the district attorney's office, and suddenly, little extra girl found herself on the way to Mexico City. Never to return.
DeMille, the cynical businessman, was one thing. DeMille, the man of God, was quite another. After the filming of The Crucifixion, which took place late on Christmas Eve, DeMille called everyone back for an impromptu sermon.
And he said, "I would like you to pause before you go home. If we could have 5 minutes of absolute quiet, where you just begin to think in your heart of what you've seen, what we filmed, and what it means to you." People stood there, and then some turned back and walked up toward the cross and knelt on their knees. And some wept, some prayed. It was very, very moving. And that film to him was the most precious film he ever made, the most important. It was the completion of a dream that he'd always had.
Unfortunately, his other dream of independence foundered. He lost control of his own company and briefly joined MGM. But even MGM wasn't big enough to hold two such giant egos as Louis B. Mayer and DeMille, and after 3 indifferent and unhappy films, it was DeMille who left to rejoin the Lasky company, now renamed Paramount. There he had 2 immediate and enormous hits, The Sign of the Cross and Cleopatra.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just left the set of Cleopatra, and I'm bringing the set and the artists with me. This is Mr. Henry Wilcoxon, who is Mark Antony, and a very wonderful one. He is just about to die for love over on stage 8.
I was to be naked dancing on the back of a bull live. And that took me aback because very little you can do on the back of a bull but cling. So I got off and I started doing a dance. And then Cecil said, oh, no, this won't do. There's no sex. There's nothing. It is no excitement. This wouldn't seduce anybody. And he said, this wouldn't seduce me. He turned to the censor. The censor who was there to see that we didn't do anything so dirty it wouldn't be allowed on the screen. He said, would that arouse you? And the man said, hell no. And that's when everything broke. And I lost my temper and said, Cecil said, well, I want the kind of dance we had in Sign of the Cross, a lesbian dance. I said, I thought that was one of the funniest things I ever saw. And he said, well, baby, that's the kind of humor we're looking for. Oh, I think he got seduced by his own sexual dreams. I think he just went soft and corrupted with them.
He was the most commercial person. I mean, he did everything for money. I mean, he was satisfied. He was pleased, I think, when they called it art. But he knew, he knew pretty well that the art had paid off.
By now, as only befitted a man of his eminence, DeMille was living in a large and impressive house in one of the most desirable parts of Hollywood. But that apart, his own lifestyle hardly compared with the lavish and sybaritic lifestyle so often depicted in his films.
His life was quite austere within the family range. He slept only about 5 hours a night, read the Bible before he fell asleep, and then he woke up early in the morning and had his bath and did all those things, and then he took his car and went off to the studio, and there he had a terrible day.
Well, the DeMille at the studio had to be thinking of cost, delay. It's a very pressure job. Producer, director combined. It's a very pressure job.
You townspeople over beyond the gates there. Yes, now as these crusaders come riding through.
He'd be on the set by 9 o'clock, certainly, maybe earlier. And he'd keep working all day long with an hour's break for lunch, but hard. And sometimes with great mobs of people. And this takes an animal strength. And a lot of the time he got quite rough with them because he had to get it out of them. He whipped them into what he wanted.
Of such a scene. Don't be extras. Be a nation, watching its manhood ride out on a great cause. The crusade. All right, now, give me everything you've got, you people. Ready now? Right? Come on, come up to it now.
Speed, 957.
Places, everybody. This is a take. Clear the set. Camera.
He was very demanding, very austere. He talked to his actors, although there were pigeons. You do this and you do that, and everybody stood around in awe, really.
He scared the wits out of everybody, and he was a disciplinarian, and he was very exacting, and no nonsense, none whatsoever.
You were there to do a job. You weren't there to play around. He expected you to be concentrated on the work, not dilly-dallying off in the corner and whispering till the last minute, or interrupting a take or anything like that.
Quiet, quiet, quiet. We're trying to take a scene here. We've got 4,000 people on this set. You people chatter like a lot of monkeys. Now keep quiet and attend to your business. What's that girl doing over there with a 1935 headdress? You know, this isn't a fantasy, this is history.
Sometimes it'd be a little rough on whoever it was, on the actors or on somebody who might be alibying or not doing their best or something like that. And he might go overboard a little, and he might also ham it up a bit.
Assistant director, one of your men, Tate, McDonald. What's the idea of having a girl come on a set like that without a wig?
He had a justifiable reputation for tearing strips off prop men and wardrobe people and assistant directors. But those targets were chosen so carefully that I couldn't but feel that it was something of a performance.
Well, I think there was a certain theatricality sometimes because it's effective.
For instance, if Gary Cooper was giving a sloppy performance, he would tear into the smallest person on the set.
He really, more than anybody else, I think, believed in this country. And he didn't care whether whether people called it over-patriotism or what, but he believed in this country. And he wanted to show it.
Politically, DeMille was rigidly conservative, an active and powerful member of the Republican Party. Indeed, he was as dogmatic in his politics as he was on the film set, though naturally he didn't quite see it that way himself.
Contrary to the popular conception, he did not like yes men. He always said, I don't want people agreeing with me all the time. I don't want 50 little DeMilles running around the set. It's bad enough to have one, let alone 50. But by the same token, he didn't like, quote, no men.
You didn't contradict Cecil later in life, ever. If he said at the dinner table, the greatest poem in the English language is Kipling's If, and my jaw dropped, it dropped silently.
He was slightly commanding. I don't want to use the word dictatorial, but he was dictatorial. I convinced Mr. DeMille that I was an Indian. And we had to speak through an interpreter, who also did not speak Cheyenne. Then a very dramatic thing happened. I didn't approve of the way Mr. DeMille was directing the scene. And I told him so, and we had a big discussion through the interpreter. So then finally, DeMille said something about fire him, get rid of him, and suddenly I just couldn't stand it anymore. And I said, Mr. DeMille, we're both being fooled here, and I must tell you. He says, you speak English. I said, I know. Not only do I speak English, I don't speak one word of Cheyenne, but I can play the part, but this is a silly shot. He says, what do you mean it's silly? You know, and I mean, the whole, you know, DeMille was an emperor at the time, and nobody ever talked back to the emperor. But like the old emperor's story, you see, I dared talk to him because I didn't depend upon him for a livelihood. So I said, you know, it's a silly sin because obviously that fire is made by a white man. And I'm not going to be, I'd be a silly Indian to stand here and let Gary Cooper shoot at me, so I'm going to hide behind a tree. DeMille said, well, and I must say it was lovely because the boy's absolutely right.
Hollywood, California, Monday, June 1st, 1936. We give you that outstanding figure of the motion picture world, Mr. Cecil B. DeMille.
Greetings from Hollywood, ladies and gentlemen. There are two theaters in this town, almost as famous as Hollywood itself.
From 1936 to 1945, DeMille presented a radio show called the Lux Theatre of the Air, which featured all the star names in Hollywood and drew a weekly audience of up to 30 million people. But in January 1945, he was banned from the show and indeed from radio and television generally because of a dispute with his union. This union, the American Federation of Radio Artists, had imposed a $1 a head levy on all its members to establish a political fighting fund. The object of the fund was to oppose some California state legislation which would have abolished the closed shop. Now DeMille, the arch-conservative, who would certainly have regarded Attila the Hun as a dangerous pinko, strongly disapproved of the closed shop, but he disapproved even more strongly of the very idea that any union had the right to impose a compulsory political levy on its members. So he refused to pay his dollar.
And they told him before he started the fight that we could lose everything. And he said, well, I think about it. And I remember he came down to breakfast one day and he said, well, Pat, I've made a decision. We're going to fight it. And I said, why did you elect to do that, grandfather? He said, because I have to shave every morning.
And look at himself in the mirror.
Look at himself in the mirror.
This week, for the first time in 8 years, the voice of producer Cecil B. DeMille was missing from radio's top dramatic program, the Radio Theater, on Monday evening.
And so, on a point of principle, DeMille was ejected from his union and banned from the air. That point of principle was to cost him $100,000 a year in lost fees. But just as significantly, perhaps, it foreshadowed the extreme right-wing stance he was to adopt a few years later when Senator Joe McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee conducted its infamous anti-communist witch hunt in Hollywood.
Anybody that he suspected of being left-wing or communist or socialist in any way, he abhorred. He wouldn't hire them. He had a political organization formed of his own, which was called the Cecil B. DeMille Foundation for Political Freedom.
In 1950, DeMille tried to force all the members of the Screen Directors Guild to sign a loyalty oath to prove they weren't communists. In effect, this was a move to overthrow the Guild's president, Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who was too liberal for DeMille's taste. An emergency meeting of all Hollywood directors was called, at which DeMille unwisely suggested that Mankiewicz and some of his allies were suspect because of their foreign backgrounds.
The meeting had reached that polemic level when John Ford stood up. And he said, I'm John Ford. I make Westerns. He said, there isn't one person in this room. Now, mind you, the people in the room were the top movie directors in America. There isn't one person in this room who knows as much about what the public wants to see as Cecil B. DeMille. And he knows how to give it to them. And for that, I respect him. Then he turned to DeMille, who was about 20 feet away across the room, and he said, but I don't like you, CB. And he said, and I don't like what you've been saying here tonight. He said, Joe Mankiewicz has been vilified, and I think he deserves an apology, and I think you should give it to him.
DeMille was thus outmaneuvered and humiliated by his fellow directors, but the public still supported him and flocked to see his latest epic, Samson and Delilah, starring Victor Mature and Hedy Lamarr. The critics, however, quite rightly derided both the film and the principal performances, but then DeMille's strength was never as a director of actors.
Storm is cool. I will rest here.
Let him be scourged until he turns from his God.
Go, Delilah. Run. Into the courtyard.
No.
Death will come into this temple. The hand of the Lord will strike.
I will not be afraid.
You must leave now. Wherever you are, my love is with you. Go.
I would put him very close to the top for the ability to do the spectacular. By the same token, you probably would not go to him to find out how to do the very intimate and subtle and modern. He didn't quite understand it.
He was not particularly good at stimulating the actor into the accidental nuances of a performance.
To us, he said that he paid good money for his actors, and he had confidence in their ability, and therefore they were to show him how to interpret a scene.
No, he once said to an actor, and I was standing next to him when it happened, this Poor actor. I wish he hadn't opened his mouth, but he said, Mr. DeMille, how would you like me to do this scene? He had piercing eyes. When he looked at you, you were looked at. Like this. He said, I am not running a school. I hired you to act, and I'm paying you for that, so act.
As Hollywood began to crumble under the onslaught of television in the early and middle years of the 1950s, it was DeMille's films that kept Paramount in business. Whatever their artistic merits or lack of same, they made money. And so while all around him other moguls perished, DeMille himself survived, a legendary figure on the studio lot.
Paramount had an arch above it that said famous players in Paramount and so on. And many wonderful directors were working at that time. They all drove in this gate. DeMille had a gate that was the DeMille gate, and it was quite separate from the rest of the studio, and if you were an extra and called to work for DeMille, you went to the DeMille gate, not to the regular gate.
In 1950, Billy Wilder made a film called Sunset Boulevard. It was the story of an aging film star trying to make a comeback. Gloria Swanson played the aging star. DeMille, then 69 years old, played himself as a benevolent despot, emphasizing the benevolence.
Hello, Mr. DeMille.
It's good to see you.
The last time I saw you was someplace very gay. I remember waving to you. I was dancing on a table.
A lot of people were. Lindbergh had just landed in Paris. Come on.
He was a hard man to know because he was a very shy man. And to overcome it, he became an actor on the set at work. It's hard for a shy man, I think, to be a director of thousands of extras. And it's hard for a shy man to walk into financial situations where you're asking for millions of dollars for a picture they don't think should be made. So he adopted a way in which he could cope with, a shy man could cope with those situations. At home, the mask went, and he was a gentle, lovely, delightful man.
In this lies the whole key to the DeMille character, the actor who believed totally the role he was playing at the moment that he was playing it. When he sat in the bosom of his family, he suddenly became the pillar of the American family. That was one important role. The other role was the rather flamboyant figure, the showman.
And now, for the first time in this or any other circus, the great Sebastian will attempt a double somersault over the bar through a hoop, scorning a net or any other safety device.
The Greatest Show on Earth was a circus story and won the Academy Award for Best Picture of the Year. It was the only one of all DeMille's 72 films to gain such recognition for the man who'd made so much money for the movie industry.
Who took that net down?
He did. He went up again?
It's too late now. He's ready to go.
There was, however, one other noteworthy aspect of The Greatest Show on Earth. It introduced Charlton Heston in his first major role as the circus manager, and Heston went on to play Moses in DeMille's last picture, a remake of the Ten Commandments.
Someone pointed out to him that I looked quite a lot like the Michelangelo statue of Moses.
Here is a photograph of the original statue in Rome. Notice the likeness to Charlton Heston, who plays Moses in the Ten Commandments.
And he called me in for an interview on it very early on, more than a year before he finally decided. This seems to have been his casting method. You never got to read a script for DeMille. And his desk was, indeed his whole office was covered with sketches and models and props. And he would show you these things and tell you the story of the film and your character.
The Bible omits the first 30 years or so that brought Moses to manhood. To fill in those missing years, we turn to ancient historians.
He worked very carefully. His preparations were very specific.
He spent years in preparation because he said the cheapest part of making a film is writing time, preparation time. Once you're on the set, the whole thing becomes terribly expensive. So you must do it all now. Everything must be in that script. I could give you an example by reading you the Ten Commandments when they were raising the great obelisk. The gong slave swings with all his might against the bronze slab. The heavy basalt sledges swing down in unison and crash against the timbers, knocking them free. The loops of the restraining hawser fly loose from the ratchet timbers amid a groaning, grinding thunder, like a mountain starting to shake.
2,000 slaves on the ropes.
And there's even a reference to a picture. You see, he's had one of the set artists, do a sketch from our script. There was no limitation on what you could conceive, on what you could write. I think any writer in the world wanted to work with him except for one thing. He paid the worst.
Well, maybe, but if he was a tight-fisted employer, he was also a regular and steadfast one.
He was very loyal to people who were loyal to him and vice versa. It was an important quality. And I saw a man stop him, and he was an extra whom I knew of previous, picture dealings. And Mr. DeMille was very intuitive, and he saw and felt that this man needed money. And Mr. DeMille pulled out a $100 bill, and he gave it to him, and he said, don't worry about it. When you start working for me, you can pay me back.
And that was the way he was with all his staff, with his actresses, his mistresses, his faithful members of the staff. Nobody ever really was in danger of serious want.
Did he have friends?
No, he had none. Not friends. That his daughter told me that. As he grew older, nobody.
Let me say that the last man I would want to be is Cecil B. DeMille, because I'm sure he was a very, very lonely man. In spite of all the show, in spite of all the... I don't think that Cecil B. DeMille was a happy man in that sense, because he was probably so many personalities.
DeMille the man seemed to combine the public image of a despot with private benevolence, devout Christianity with a touch of hypocrisy. He made his biblical films, he said, to inculcate in his audience a sense of right and wrong, but he was also shrewd enough to observe that the Bible was a perennial bestseller, and he saw no reason to waste 2,000 years of free publicity. He used the Bible to uplift the spirit, to titillate the flesh, and to keep the box office happy. In his private life, he preached and ostensibly practiced the virtues of fidelity by remaining married to the same wife for well over half a century, while also conducting long-running love affairs with 2 other women. If his films were a mixture of Victorian morality, piety, sex, and retribution, then much the same might be said of DeMille's own life, if you take away the retribution, which never did seem to be visited upon him.
Congratulations from everyone here.
Cecil Blount DeMille died aged 77 on January the 21st, 1959. Quite possibly, very few of the congregation had turned up out of affection, but they all turned up out of respect. For when DeMille died, the breed of showman became extinct. It was like burying the last of the dinosaurs.
Making a movie is having a white wall in front of you with nothing on it. And now you as the movie maker are supposed to put something on there that makes people look at it. Cecil B. DeMille knew how to put something there that had more people look at it than all the other members of the Directors Guild.
Behold his mighty hand!
At one time, the remake of The Ten Commandments was second only to Gone with the Wind as the biggest money spinner in cinema history. Nearly all DeMille's films made handsome profits, and yet he was never really satisfied with his work, never convinced that the finished film lived up to the fantastic vision with which it had begun.
He was terrified that the audience would go to sleep, that he couldn't hold them, that he'd lose their interest. And that's why perhaps he overcluttered his films, and that's why we kept bringing in every kind of thing happening every minute.
Cecil B. DeMille destroyed the temple at Gaza, burnt Rome, and parted the Red Sea, not once but twice, and even God can't beat that. Well, such a record firmly establishes him as the greatest showman the cinema has ever seen. Somebody once described him as less a director than a salesman, and somebody else once said that he made small-minded pictures on a large scale. Well, towards the end of his career, when the old, breathtaking flamboyance had degenerated somewhat into vulgarity, such criticisms may perhaps have been true. But they do little justice to his early work, and particularly to the remarkable versatility he showed in his silent pictures. The hallmark of a DeMille film was size. He thought big, not often deeply, but big. Now, big is not necessarily always beautiful, but nor is it necessarily always crass. There's a favourite clericue in Hollywood that runs, Cecil B. DeMille, much against his will, was persuaded to leave Moses out of the Wars of the Roses. Well, there speaks the voice of envy. DeMille may often have been guilty of monumental bad taste, but he was never stupid. He was, in fact, a giant in an industry which very rarely throws up giants. And as such, he was easy to deride, but impossible to ignore.
It's very gracious of you to receive me in your homes tonight. It moved me very deeply, and I hope that I may be worthy of the trust that you've put in my hands for almost half a century.